All right, y'all, you are joining us for a very special mini-series here at PreventConnect. I am Janae Sargent, and I am joined by my colleague, friend, and oftentimes co-host, Ashley Cline Jimenez.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley. We're doing this mini-series that is looking at the transformative journey of the Delta Project, a first-of-its-kind initiative by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention aimed at preventing intimate partner violence. Over the course of the episodes, we will explore the rich history, innovative approaches, and profound impact of Delta through the voices of those who have been instrumental in its success.
Join us as we sit down with CDC, national technical assistance providers, and past and present Delta grantees who share their unique insights and experiences. From the early days of Delta to the latest advancements in Delta Ahead, this podcast celebrates the strategies that have shaped intimate partner violence prevention at the community and societal levels.
Welcome back to Delta Reflections, Shaping the Future of Intimate Partner Violence Prevention. In this episode, we will be exploring the community impact of the Delta Project by hearing firsthand accounts from Delta recipients, both former and current, talk about their successes and challenges in implementing IPV prevention strategies. And joining us today is Rebecca Cline, formerly from the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, a Delta grantee since the very beginning of the project. Rebecca, it is so good to be here with you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to share the Delta journey.
We're so excited to hear about the Delta journey because as someone who's been around since the beginning of the project, I'm sure you have a lot of stories and a lot of wisdom to share with us.
Let's hope it's not too boring, right?
No, not at all. I'm so excited.
Yeah.
So Rebecca, as someone who's been involved with Delta since its inception, I'm hoping that you can talk with us and share your perspective on the role that state domestic violence coalitions played in shaping and implementing Delta strategies, because this is such an important aspect of Delta is really the leadership of state coalitions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the way the whole program was designed from the beginning, that the CDC would have a cooperative agreement with the coalitions instead of a grant, really gave the coalitions a big advantage. We developed a learning community, which we later called a community of practice. And we drafted plans about what we expected would happen instead of lists of outputs. We're going to do this, and this. We would be able to kind of imagine what we hoped would happen over the course of a period of funding. What's interesting is that 20 years ago, when we talked about prevention, coalition staff really thought about prevention in terms of preventing the next episode of violence. And I remember going to a staff meeting with an enraged fellow staffer who couldn't believe that none of the Delta dollars could be used for victim services, for direct services, that all of the Delta money had to be used for capacity building at the coalition level and the community level, or prevention education. So that was a real big change for grant programs. Secondly, each coalition was able to draft its own strategies and activities based on what their unique context was. While each coalition is sort of similar, there's some, like certain things that are kind of common for all the coalitions. Each state is a completely different context. And so we were able to really craft our strategies and activities based on what our strengths and opportunities were in Ohio. Some of the things that happened, the coalitions led the way on creating guidance for primary prevention. You may be familiar with the Virginia guidelines for intimate partner violence and sexual violence prevention. That came out of the first 10 years of Delta. And that was really groundbreaking. Nobody had done anything like that before. We all knew the principles of prevention, but to really articulate them fully and how they might impact at the community level was a huge contribution to the field. In Ohio, we partnered with the Ohio Department of Health and created the first statewide strategic plan for primary prevention. We called it Pathways in Prevention, a Roadmap for Change, which really helped guide our work over those next 5 years. And, that was another groundbreaking innovation that we created using a really interesting group of key informants and people who could help inform prevention across the state of Ohio.
That's amazing and sounds like such incredibly impactful work. Obviously, as you just shared, Ohio Domestic Violence Network has been working diligently to implement IPV prevention and really the building blocks of IPV prevention through the Delta Project. I'm already hearing some successes, especially with that plan. That sounds really exciting, and I can only imagine how much that did for young preventionists. Can you talk about some of the other successes that you've experienced in your time working with Delta?
Yeah, I think one of the main successes we had was we were able to fund, like I said earlier, the 2 local programs over the 20 some years that I was with the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. So what that meant is that those local programs really got to build deep capacity. There were times when I thought they had greater prevention capacity than we did at the state coalition. For so long, it was me and maybe one other person as a coordinator, and the local programs were able to figure out how to use RPE dollars, Delta dollars, and other grant funding at the local level to really build a prevention program that was robust. So I think that that's one of the key successes that we had. So another thing that we did early on was we created a listserv. Imagine that. We thought that was something really cool. So we connected people across the state through email communication. And then the pandemic happened. And lo and behold, guess what? We all started meeting like this, in virtual spaces. And that was a real success to sort of create a support group for preventionists. In so many agencies, preventionists are isolated in the work that they do. They're the only prevention educator in an agency, especially those that are not funded by Delta. And there's way more not funded by Delta than there are funded by Delta across the country. And to create a mechanism for people to share what they were doing locally to help give them some guidance about what prevention really looks like, and to create a community where the local programs could share with one another what they were doing rather than have the state, domestic violence coalition come in and say, well, this is what you should be doing. Really trying to foster that sense of community and community learning. So that was another success that I'd like to point to. One of the things I'm most proud of is the creation of the Ohio Men's Action Network. And that was created in 2012 after years of trying to figure out what it looks like to engage men. I mean, in 2006, we had Tony Porter come. We worked with Neil Irvin and the Most Clubs. We had Most Clubs all over the state, but we just really didn't have a way to sort of capitalize on the local programs' work and to have a statewide network of people interested in engaging men. So that's Glenn Harris, who is currently the prevention director at ODVN, continues to convene a steering committee of men and women committed to engaging men in Ohio. And I think, that's been sustained for 14 years now. That's pretty exciting. And then, like during Delta Impact, that was the last 5 years that I was on staff. We really took a deep dive into data collection and analysis, and authored an environmental scan and created a data dashboard, and both rest on ODVN's website. And we really were looking at the interplay between risk and protective factors and the social determinants of health, and how those impact at the state and the community level, and ultimately on the individual level, right? We've done a whole lot, right? But those are a few of the highlights that I'd like to share with you.
Oh my gosh, you really have done a whole lot. Oh my goodness. You're listening to PreventConnect, the podcast bringing together voices from across the movement to end gender and power-based violence, to give you the tools to practice primary prevention in your daily life and at work. We're highlighting emerging research, promising strategies, and stories from on-the-ground prevention practitioners doing this work in new and innovative ways. Bringing you topics like foundational strategies to prevent violence, primary prevention, health equity in practice, authentic community engagement, and more. I'm your host, Janae Sargent, and this is PreventConnect. There are so many things that I feel like young preventionists take for granted, right? Like you were sharing like a listserv and a way to connect with each other. When you spoke about it, like, I know it might just sound, like a listserv and not that big of a deal, but that's a huge deal. And without that, we wouldn't have online spaces to connect. Things that feel so regular now, it was not always the case where you could hop onto a 500-person web conference or hop into a Zoom learning community or have a listserv. The ability for preventionists to connect with each other, we know, is incredibly valuable. And it's so funny, you reminded me of our last interview that we had with Rebecca Cline from the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. Casey was talking about the beginning of Delta coinciding with the beginning of the internet. And so many of the things that they were working on, really creating the building blocks to how we do prevention now. So I really appreciate you sharing that, and such incredible work with the steering committee and the men's network. That's amazing. And I know that along with all of those successes, every project faces its challenges. And I imagine it sounds like you were the first to do a lot of things. So hats off to you. And I can't imagine that's easy. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about some of the most significant challenges you encountered in your work with Delta and efforts to prevent intimate partner violence in Ohio.
There were a few challenges, let me just say.
Just a few.
I remember at one point thinking I was going to get fired because I made a derogatory comment about Appalachian people that I had no clue was derogatory, right? And one of our projects at the time was centered in Appalachian, Ohio. And, so thus began my journey on becoming a little more culturally sensitive and aware. And I'll tell more stories about some of that later. But fortunately, my boss just said, you need to educate yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And
you don't know what you don't know. And I have so often found that doing this work means that you are signing up for self-accountability and constant learning, which is tough and it's brave and it's important.
Thank you for that. It is, absolutely. You can't do prevention unless you're really thinking about the intersections of all the oppressions, because violence is oppression. Yeah. Yep. So other challenges, just like I said earlier, the resistance to the idea that IPV could be prevented from happening in the first place felt like sort of an uphill race, because, when you think about it, almost everyone is exposed to some kind of trauma when they're young. And so the question was always posed early on, given that everyone has been exposed to violence, how can you work with classrooms? How can you prevent young people or any people from experiencing violence? And so we had to get really smart about what we were talking about and what we were doing, and help to assure communities that prevention educators are skilled at prevention education, but also skilled at response. So if somebody discloses in a classroom, they know what to do, and they're not like deer in headlights. Oh my gosh, now what, right? And we also began helping communities talk not about intimate partner violence, because that's one of those buzz terms that I think turns communities and people off. But you could talk about dating violence or teen relationship abuse, and that would resonate. And then we really got smart. We started talking about the adverse childhood experiences and the intersections with ACEs and primary prevention. And if we can prevent ACEs, then we can do some really interesting prevention work for the life trajectory of people who may have experienced and hopefully even prevent, right? Because those people who may have experienced some sort of a traumatic event, it might not be dating violence or intimate partner violence, but that can certainly lead one on a trajectory towards those things. So whatever we can do to keep that from happening is good. I think a perpetual challenge is the funding silos, and Delta, right? Delta is such a tiny piece of federal resources. Only currently, I think, 12 or 13 are funded for Delta right now. For years, they would only fund 10. Early on in the Delta, there were 13 or 14 in the cohort. But when you consider that RPE is funded for all states and territories, it really helps you understand what limited impact Delta can have. And it's had huge impact on the conversation. But, one day, Congress needs to figure out how to fund all 50 states and territories if a difference is really going to be made around intimate partner violence prevention. I think about youth violence, gang violence, gun violence, and all the other forms of violence that communities are funded to prevent. And they're in a conversation around scarcity. And transforming that conversation from scarcity and trying to figure out how to work across all those different silos to create a community-driven, community-led violence prevention program, strategies, activities, whatever that looks like, would it promise such a greater impact than just these little funding sources here and there? We see that in urban areas that come together and really create big impact projects. It'd be nice to be able to do that. And I think another challenge is knowing today what we know about the determinants of health, where people live, work, play, and pray and learn. And, if those places are resource starved or thriving, that sort of gives you a glimmer into what kind of things are happening in the community. And when communities are under-resourced and there's hopelessness and poverty that prevail, violence follows. The challenge is that our policymakers don't want to fund a living wage. They don't want to fund to make sure that every American is housed. I could go on, but I think you get the picture, right? It's a big challenge.
Yeah. Thank you for walking us through, your experiences and the challenges that you faced and seen in this work. And, I think that a lot of what we continue to hear is around kind of the first challenge that you spoke about. How do we talk about prevention? How do we message prevention? How do we explain prevention so that people can relate to it, can see their role in it, can believe in it. We say so often that prevention is possible, that violence isn't inevitable, that we can prevent it. And then I know for me, when I'm like talking to my family and they start asking, okay, well, how? And I start telling them, sometimes I get, tongue tied or I don't know. Yeah, because it's like, there's so much. And there's so many things kind of working against, like you were just speaking about, Rebecca, against what we know would prevent not just intimate partner violence, but all forms of violence. It's overwhelming. It's overwhelming to preventionists. So of course it's going to be overwhelming to people who are, true believers yet in the promise of prevention. One thing that, I have to say over my years of working on PreventConnect is we've often looked at what you all were doing in Ohio, in Delta, and just, saw so much inspiration and so much strength in your work. And I think a lot of that has been around your ability to really connect with community and to really center the local context of what was happening in your state and in local communities. And I think that so many of the current conversations around prevention and advancing health equity is that community engagement is really the way, right? It's crucial for the success of any prevention strategy, approach, initiative. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how Delta has helped to foster community engagement and support for intimate partner violence prevention strategies.
Oh, well, I think I'll take a little bit of that on a little bit later, but the reality is that nothing happens without community. We can get funded at the state level. We could put all that money in our pockets, but if we didn't pass it through to the local level, we would never learn any lessons about what works in terms of prevention because, like you said, Ashley, prevention happens at the community level. And a prevention educator can do nothing. They can do nothing if they are isolated in an agency and the agency thinks that their job is to go do community education. And sometimes that's really hard in a state where, so we have 88 counties in Ohio. 88 counties and 2 received Delta funding while I was at ODVN, and now currently 1 does. So when you think about all those other 86 counties where there's not a lot of funding, they might get a little bit of RPE funding, but asking a preventionist to not only do whatever job is written into their output section, right? United Way is good at helping support programs, but they really want to know what your outputs are. So instead of being able to say that the output is community engagement, they're thinking more in terms of things, right? How many pamphlets can we get in people's hands? Which, we learned a long time ago that a piece of paper is not going to prevent anything. I think one of the things that we learned was community is where it has to happen, and supporting communities to make that happen is what our job as a coalition needs to be. Let local programs do their work, give them the glory that they deserve, right? And honor them and respect what they're telling us is their local context. And I learned really early on that my idea of community, I needed to listen. I needed to have my ears open whenever I was going into a community as the state prevention director, whatever, and really sit back and listen and not direct.
That's so huge, Rebecca. It really is, because it's so maybe like a relic of our movement to come into places, whether it's a community or a classroom, and tell people like, oh, this is what you should be doing. This is what you need to do. And sometimes, we have a lot of knowledge about prevention, about what the evidence base is. But if we're not living and breathing these experiences that people are in their local communities, we really we can't tell people what they should be doing. That solutions have always been found within community, right? And sometimes the problems that community members feel really impacted by are not going to be intimate partner violence or sexual violence. It's going to be something connected, right? Like not being able to make a living wage, not having childcare, not being able to feed your family. We know that that's all connected. But I think that it's taken our movement a while to really understand that that's what the community wants, is where we really need to go. And something else that you said really resonated with me, because I started working at a rape crisis center 20 years ago as a prevention educator. And I remember I was the only one at the time, and some of my rape crisis center colleagues who are doing response were like, we don't even know what Ashley does. She like goes to meetings. And it was like, well, yeah, I do go to a lot of meetings, but we have to connect to our other organizations, our other agencies. We have to connect to the businesses. We have to connect to like the neighborhood associations and the leaders in our community, because if we don't, how do we know what's happening? How do they know that like we exist? How do we become part of the solution if we're not talking to these folks? It was always an interesting conversation, because I didn't have like, oh, well, I gave out this many pamphlets or saw this many people in the office. It was like, no, I went to a community event.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's like a specific story or example that comes to mind when you think back over the years of how the work that you all did in Delta positively impacted a community in Ohio.
Well, I think about the Teen Alliance Council and the Teen Advisory Councils that were formed out of Delta. Early on, it was recognized that working with youth was really important in Ohio and in the communities that we funded. And out of that commitment, one agency created what they called the Teen Advisory Council, but they put some members on their board of directors, on the agency board of directors, which was really different. And then another community, what they did was create leadership opportunities for young people. And both programs supported each other in creating and developing like an annual teen summit that youth would be there, and the staff would listen to the youth and listen to what they wanted to do. They would use all that information, and the youth would actually create committees to get all this work done. Yeah, it took staff time because staff were there to guide, but not to tell them what to do. And that's what I think was one of the most innovative processes that came out of Delta, was really listening to youth voice, supporting youth leadership, and then, creating avenues for them to express themselves. Knox County did TikToks, violence prevention TikToks, and then, they have what they call a Color for the Cause run every year. And I remember going to like the first Color for a Cause run, and maybe 40 people showed up. And every year after that, it got bigger to now they're hosting events where 400 or 500 people show up to do a 5K run walk, which is pretty amazing. And then throughout that path, They have, and this is all led by the young people. The young people create posters that have statistics about prevention and intimate partner violence and sexual violence up along the pathway, so people can learn. And I mean, I think that's pretty cool.
That's really cool. That's amazing. Congratulations on those. You know, as you're sharing about the youth leadership councils, I have found that is some of the most transformational work that we can do as preventionists, because it also transforms the culture of our agencies from top down, which is something that we have to so intentionally grapple with at every stage, because we follow corporate culture here. You know, we get funding from somewhere. We're beholden to that. We have hierarchy. And as we know, that works in direct conflict to how actual change happens in communities. It's a really hard balance to walk. But I find when organizations can truly center youth, and instead of thinking about how to make youth fit into their boxes, like turn off the ego and think about how we can fit in to youth aspiration and youth inspiration, and then a lot changes. So it's incredible.
Thank you for saying that. You know, if all of us at the state and national level could always remember to check your ego at the door, you know, for every meeting we go to, we're not there to be driven by our egos. We're really there for the community. And the only way we can be there for the community is if we, you know, do our best to keep me out of it, you know, and just to be there as a change agent, a vessel to help the community move in the direction that it wants. The other thing I wanted to mention about the youth advisory councils was that, you know, both of the programs, like I said earlier, were funded by RPE and Delta. But because of the youth councils and the way that they worked with the youth, you know, alcohol and addictions, mental health and addiction services in Ohio helped fund another part of their work. So they were preventing intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and risky behaviors, you know, drugs and alcohol use while they were doing their community-based prevention. And it's brilliant when you think about it. You know, there's the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services that does its thing, which is very similar to what we're doing, but different language. And then the local programs were able to figure out how to garner additional resources to bring to bear to help promote young people and youth voice.
Well, that's amazing. That's such a challenge to actually lean into intersectionality from a partnership piece, partially because of ego, partially because we speak different languages, even though we're focused on the same risk and protective factors, partially because we've been set up in silos. There's so many things working against true, authentic community engagement. And I can see everything that you all are doing to strive toward that anyway. And I'm in awe, honestly. You know, you spoke to this. I think this has a lot to do, maybe I'm previewing this next question, with checking your ego. And you spoke to this a little bit earlier too, but kind of following along this trajectory, what lessons have you learned from working with diverse communities? And how have those lessons shaped your approach to intimate partner violence prevention? I don't know, career, life, wherever that goes.
Yeah. Oh, well, so one of the most important lessons learned is, like we've been talking, right? Prevention needs to be community-based and community-driven. And, you know, like I said, again, all things happen within a community. I think one of my biggest lessons learned was agency place just doesn't work. Like I said before, and what works is listening to the community and what the community thinks is important. I think about Warren County, where prevention of IPV became a broader community-based initiative, you know, especially during the pandemic. They wanted to figure out how can we reach people safely And so they created storybook strolls. And in the county seat is Lebanon in Warren County, Ohio. And they worked with Parks and Recreation to have a book on kindness put in a storybook stroll in this park. And they had the author come and they had a big gathering. I mean, it was just really wonderful to see the community come out for this prevention event during the pandemic where people felt safer because we were all outside enjoying nature and enjoying the lessons of a book about how to be kind, how to fill your bucket with kindness. And I think about that and we often think, well, so what does having access to green space do, for prevention? And like you said, Ashley, we have learned so much about how the built environment of a community makes a huge difference. And that built environment includes green spaces and public parks, places where people can enjoy nature and listening to the birds, and how calming that is when listening to gunshots is not necessarily calming, right? In Warren County now, each community in Warren, each little municipality in Warren County has been asking for a storybook stroll. So they're expanding that. And then other counties that are around Warren County down in southwestern Ohio are looking to the preventionists at Safe on Main to help them figure out how to keep that going. So community, that's a lesson learned. Another lesson is to acknowledge the leadership of young people and to support their leadership development. They're our future, and we need to help support young people to understand what healthy and unhealthy relationships look like and how to help someone in need. So the more we can do that, the more we'll continue to transform communities and schools and all kinds of other spaces. And I think my biggest lesson learned really through all of this, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, has been to honor the voices of those who are not in the room. Those folks that are most marginalized by the impacts of poverty, unaffordable housing, food and healthcare deserts, and mostly by white supremacy culture. Let's just say it, right? I learned the hard way about what microaggressions look like and sound like. I learned that the best way for me to work as a white woman in this movement is to be on a lifelong learning trajectory. Like I think, Ashley, you said, you just got to keep learning. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of as I've retired is that in 2019, after one of our statewide leadership programs, during which I am told I committed at least one pretty horrific microaggression, that I held myself accountable for. But then one of the things that came out of that is a small book club that formed to explore anti-oppression themes and to help grow our understanding about white supremacy culture and colonialism in the U.S. And, and I'm really proud to say that even in my retirement, I remain a member of that book club. And so, the journey toward aspiring allyship never ends. And so I keep journeying on in that way.
Thank you for sharing that personal reflection, Rebecca, because I think that's really helpful for me to hear that, we often make mistakes as we go through life in our personal lives, in our professional spaces. And I think what's truly just, the way forward is being able to accept it without running away, right? Saying yeah, this is something that I'm capable of doing and holding ourselves accountable, and then being open to learning and being open to not shying away from it, not saying, this was really uncomfortable. It made me feel bad. And so I'm going to like not put myself in those spaces anymore, but rather like stepping deeper into it. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. It's painful, but I really got to learn about what white women shedding tears means to people who are less privileged than I am.
Yeah. Thank you. The other thing that I just wanted to touch on, which is going back to the Storytime Stroll strategy or initiative, is just so cool that so that story, as you're telling it, I'm like, wow, it's hitting so many things. So it's a book about kindness. So it's teaching like social emotional learning. As you talked about, you're in a green space and we know that the impact that can have. And then it's bringing community together. And so people are connecting. Maybe they're meeting people that they've never met before. And we know that community social cohesion and connection is such an incredible strategy for preventing violence. So I just love when we can look at an example of something happening that community members, they see it as fun, right? They see it as something to do with their families and with their friends and with their loved ones. And yet we can sit here and think and it's also such an incredible prevention strategy. So thank you for bringing that into this conversation. I love it. I'm going to look up more about those events. I guess as we come to a close in this conversation, it's so apparent that the Delta Project has had an impact on not just on Ohio and on the communities that were recipients of Delta funding, but also on you personally, Rebecca, and for you to take an hour out of your blissful retirement to revisit, the last couple of decades of your work. That really just speaks to the fact that I think it really has such an impact on you personally. So thank you for being willing to share all of that.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to share. And Delta changed me.
I feel like that's the perfect way to close it. Delta changed me. I mean, it's true. When you take a job in sexual or domestic violence work, you're not just signing up for a paycheck. You're signing up to be shaped by this movement and constant learning and to change. I'm a different person for coming into this career. And Rebecca, I so deeply appreciate you being so vulnerable and sharing how it's made you a different person too. Thank you. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into this episode of Delta Reflections. Rebecca, thank you. I'm so grateful that you shared your time with us. We appreciate all of you. And until next time.
PreventConnect is brought to you by Valor US and the Centers for Disease Control. You can find more information about this episode, along with past episodes, web conferences, and blog articles at PreventConnect.org. As we work to bring you more podcasts like this one, we need your help ensuring that this podcast and others like it reaches listeners like you. Take a second to rate this podcast wherever you're listening to it. That helps us show up on main podcasting pages and reach new listeners. And of course, if you have an idea for a topic that you'd like to see us cover, reach out to us and comment on this post on our Instagram page.